Yama, Gamilaroi Yaga Murray. My name's Colin Kinchala. I'm a Gamilaroi man from northwest New South Wales, and I live and work on biomedical lands in what we call Parramatta, in the city that is called Sydney. I wish to acknowledge the biomedical peoples of the Darug Nation that I'm connected to you this afternoon, and to acknowledge First Nation peoples and their nations that are joining us today. I'm also acknowledging the strength, survival, complex cultural systems that these First Nation peoples that we are so indebted to since colonization. As a First Nation man, I kind of want to get to the point where all of you that are joining us this afternoon are saying to blackfellas that my ancestors are your ancestors too, and you know it. Maybe that's a way for this country to maintain acknowledging the continued, not just past injustices, the continuing injustices of this country's First Nation peoples. Always will be First Nation land since time immemorial. Welcome to the participants today of this webinar, and we hope that you enjoy for this transformational ethical storytelling workshop. I'd like to introduce to you Doug Cronin. Doug, are you there?
Yama, Colin.
Yama, brother. How are you?
Good. Hello, everybody. And I'd like to introduce myself and also say, yes, I'm on Gadigal land today and feel very fortunate to be here. So my name's Doug, and I'm born and continue to live on Gadigal land, and I'm the co-founder of Our Race and have been a practitioner and researcher of storytelling and anti-racism for about the last 7 years. I'd also like to acknowledge that today is Aboriginal Children's Day. So I'd like to acknowledge the importance of honouring a day like today. And this year's theme is very apt. We are the elders of tomorrow, hear our voice. So we believe instead of these tokenistic listening and the speaking for First Nations people, we must make a commitment to hear these voices and stories their way. How do we get here? So for myself, I've been on a journey to reach this point. And it really was that several years ago, I worked in a government department delivering a cultural diversity anti-racism training program, which used storytelling. And so I believed in this power of storytelling. And as through that, in developing that program with some other people, we reached over, well, it's reached over 20,000 people across the country, and it's been evaluated by the ANU and found it to be very positive in having impacts on the audience in their self-reported attitudes and behaviours around ethnocentrism, anti-racism, and the like. And so we saw this as quite a good methodology to try and change the hearts and minds of people. However, over time, we've got to this point where we think, well, it's very much audience focused. So how do we start to change that methodology and our practices? At this point, I decided to start a PhD and start up Our Race, because I believe that this was actually having quite an impact and could have a broader impact if we reach other sectors. So with this idea and being naive, I thought that this storytelling model could really reach a big group of people and start to change that conversations around racism and anti-racism. However, after about 12 months, conducting research, but particularly talking to people who have been in positions to share their stories around racism, I started to see that the practice I was using could and should be challenged. And this might have been very difficult for me because I was already a fair way into a PhD and realizing that I had to change my methodology. I also had to change the practices of the organization of how we approached anti-racism. It meant taking a reflective and critical approach, looking at my own practices and research first. It's mean looking at my methodology and realizing that is problematic because it was focused so much more on the audience rather than the storytellers themselves. It was very much focused on what the story looked like on the outside rather than the constructs of the story. So I now know that I participated in the omissions and framing of people's stories. And I need to flip that. So what I've arrived to today is to a position where I hope to become an anti-racism or anti-racist storytelling practitioner. And some of the people who've who helped educate me through this have been the people I've met, including Colin and Lisa and Rifai. So I'm going to pass you over to Lisa, who's going to give you a bit of a background of what brought her here today and introduce herself.
Hello, everybody. Good morning. Good afternoon. Sorry. My name is Lisa. Today I come to you from Watorong land on the south coast of Victoria. I am a storyteller. And I'm here because I've had an experience where I called out racism in my workplace, which is a global corporation. And in order to call out racism, I had to share my story, right? And for me, it was a very empowering experience for me to share what I had been going through as a person of color in that workplace. However, their response to my problem was then to turn around and ask me to share my story in a very problematic way. And my experience of that showed me the intricacies of the power dynamic of storytelling when it is used for the benefit of the organization. And I noted that a lot of you in your introductions have talked about recognizing how powerful storytelling is. And it can be really powerful to create empathy, to make people aware of perspectives that they had no exposure to before. But there's also a balance and a dynamic of power that comes into play in that process. So having been on the receiving end of being disempowered by this invitation to share my story, I'm very passionate about educating custodians of stories about how to use that power responsibly, how to use it conscientiously, how to create a collaborative environment with the storyteller where they feel safe, where it benefits them, and how we can use stories and also so that stories then aren't used to perpetuate the very problems that they're being used to address, right? Because that's can be a little catch in there, right? You asked to share a story, but how is that story going to contribute to the very problem that you're seeking to solve? So I'm very excited that you're all here. I love to be a part of a group where people are actively seeking to make themselves more aware and more proactively responsible in how they do their work. So thank you very much. And now I'm going to back to Doug. Oh, sorry, I'm passing to Rafai. Right.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Lisa. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today. Really honored to be with you today. My name is Rifai. I'm from Syria. I've been in Australia for just over 5 years, and I'm speaking to you from the land of the Darug Nation. I'm based in Sydney. Now, today I'm here to share with you some reflections on storytelling that are based on my experience as an activist back home in Syria, as well as a storyteller for the past 8 to 9 years. Now, I got involved with our race community through an article I wrote on the risk of curated refugee stories, which I will also draw from during today's webinar, as well as the workshop. Now, like my colleagues, I'm very passionate about storytelling, and I believe in the transformative power to raise awareness about important issues. And that is why I've been very eager to take any opportunity to share my story, whether it's on Syria, the human rights violations in Syria, or refugee issues here in Australia and elsewhere. But what I noticed the more I raised the more I shared my story, the more I became aware of some of the problematic ways that I was sharing my story and the way that others were curating it and packaging it. So that is when I took a step back and I started kind of reflecting on those assumptions that I have of storytelling, what was expected, what are some of these issues with storytelling. So one thing, for instance, that I will talk about later on is that sense of obligation, that sense of pressure that people like me, people from refugee backgrounds or other backgrounds, have that obligation to share their story. They should feel honored. They should feel, privileged that they've been asked, and they should accept immediately. So since then, or even there is that problematic, assumption from, the way that the story should, how a story should look like a story from hell to paradise as well. So since then, I just became a lot more cautious, and I started maybe becoming a bit more reflective on when and how I should accept stories. Obviously, that came with a lot of other challenges. When you start declining invitations, that also can be problematic for the storyteller. And also, I'll be speaking about that later on. But for now, I'm gonna hand it over back to Doug, who will introduce our race community more fully, and also start talking about some of the problematic ways that that stories have been shared and curated.
Thanks, Rifai. And yeah, we'll talk about this in a bit more detail. So talked about the aims. So who is our race? So we see ourselves as a community-centered anti-racism storytelling social enterprise. So we believe that we need to call out racism or racist practices and call in anti-racist ones. And I think that's very important in the way that we approach this as either practitioners of storytelling or storytellers themselves, or activists or advocates in this space. And so we work with this idea of this transformational ethical storytelling framework, which both guides us and we hope will guide others. And we'll talk about this in more detail throughout today and also next week at the workshop, and how we can implement a framework which can support a better practice for storytelling. Sort of the way that we started, and particularly around critical race methodology and counter storytelling. And on top of that is looking at transformational storytelling. So some of you are probably using that within your organizations. A lot of social impact organizations use this transformational storytelling. A lot of transformational storytelling is also used by other organizations for their own purposes. And this is why we believe that we need to take this more ethical approach. So it's taking a critical and reflective approach with this aim, which critical race theory is always about, which is an aim for social justice. We also want to flip this perspective of being institutionally centered to a person community centered approach of storytelling. So we see this as an opportunity for all of us to be able to take an alternative perspective, to hear alternative voices of how we can share and create stories. So we believe that the theory is very important, but what's most important is how can we put that theory into practice? And that's what we're here with you today. And hopefully this can help support both the theory and practice coming together. So what does this mean then? So for us, we talk about, how do we reach this point? So we're trying to reach this point where we say we want to flip the power of storytelling. And that's, a long-term aim. And for us is looking at, well, what led us to see that storytelling had issues in it, and this storytelling of groups who are often marginalized. And so a few of these issues that we've identified, and they're not exhaustive, so we encourage you to add to this. These are just some of the ones that we thought we'd talk with you today in this short period of time. So the first few is this idea that they're directed by and or told by the majoritarian. So we might see a change in what we see on the screen sometimes, but maybe not behind the scenes. Who's directing those stories? The stereotyping and or dehumanizing of minority groups. That time takes precedence over the potential impacts of the story, rather than us thinking about, well, what's the impact first, and making time not as much of an issue. But sometimes we say we have this deadline and it's more important than having an ethical story. And then this other one around this audience focus with the white savior, which is often an institution. And this fits in with this assimilationist type model. And Lisa can provide a bit of a anecdote of her experience based on some of these issues that have been faced. So over to you, Lisa.
Thank you, Doug. So I work for a large publishing company, one that many would describe as having racism built into its business model. Part of my role involves reading its publications, and it traumatizes me to read content that overtly and covertly tells Australia that Black, Indigenous, and people of color are inferior, animalistic, and dangerous. But when the CEO put out an internal video calling the police officer in the George Floyd incident one bad officer and echoed support for the police force, I knew I had to make an official complaint. So I wrote a strongly worded email to the senior executives of the company I work for, citing their racist published content and internal messages, its impact on me as an employee, and the impact it will have on the sustainability of the business long term. I made suggestions on how it can be addressed, cited resources for them to educate themselves about racism, and asked for a meeting with senior executives. I got the meeting, and there I exposed the contradiction of the company's stated values to what they actually do. So they have an HR policy around equal opportunity and anti-discrimination. But how is equal opportunity possible when you are seeding the minds of Australians that I, as a person of color, am inferior? And how is it not okay for someone in the office, my colleague, to call me a monkey or a gorilla in the office, but then it's okay for you to publish content that portrays me as such? The response to my complaint included, oddly, the invitation for me to be featured in the company's internal video series, right? So this series helps employees feel more connected to the business. It features a staffer sharing their experience working through a challenging time. And the tone is very warm and fuzzy. It's meant to make you feel good about the company, which a lot of diversity videos tend to be directed to do. So, but in the context of what I shared though, the offer perplexed me, especially because the week after that meeting, the CEO had put out communication to the whole company, basically rebutting everything that I had said in the meeting. He claimed that they were taking a stand against racism, but he did that by citing tokenistic diversity gestures that they perform. That communication really galvanized the tone of the official response to my complaint. It was defensiveness, deflection, and denial, right? But yet still, they were asking me, Lisa, please come be a part of this video series and share your story to the whole company. Tell us about your experience of working as a person of color in this business. We want you to educate other employees about books that they can read about racism. We want you to, quote unquote, be the interruption to the unconscious narrative around race for more employees. Do you see the level of lack of conscientiousness in this invitation? And I must admit, for a nanosecond, the opportunity to have a bigger impact was momentarily appealing to my ego, right? But when I thought about it, here's the truth of what's lurking behind that glossy request for me to be seen. This is not a safe environment for me. The official response to my complaint about racism was denial and defensiveness, publicly stated to the whole company, right? So that sets the field of permission on the issue, and it puts me at risk for trolling. The other thing is that this would be another token performative action that the company would use to claim that they are not racist, while also allowing them to do nothing further on the issue. And I realized that that's what it would be facilitating them to do, to do nothing else, right? And also it would be handing me as an individual the burden of educating the entire staff contingent about racism, which is not my responsibility. But mostly it would be for the benefit of the organization. It would allow them to appear as if they are inclusive and progressive, despite the fact that my lived experience proves that they are not. So I declined the offer. If the company really hears me and they want to make a change, that can't start with me sharing my individual story. It has to start from them setting a clear mandate to recognize that they have a problem, to put in place policy and appropriate training to address it. And once that is in place, once it is a safe and conducive environment, then we can talk about collectively giving more voice to diverse experiences. But it has to be a commitment. It has to be a holistic, integrated movement, and not a burden placed on the shoulders of the individual or the individuals who are already suffering.
Not providing a safe space is one of the big ones that came up. And that's so often overlooked. And then the idea of that they individualize rather than take a collective voice. And when we look at storytelling across broader cultures, stories aren't about the individual. And so we need to look about the community aspect as well. And then there's this other part we see in stories around this digestible narratives where we only want to get the right person sharing the story or even the right parts of the person. And then that other part, that the story is edited without the storyteller's input. Who is editing that story? Why are they editing? And as Lisa said before, for whose benefit? And Colin can share a bit of an example for his own recent example of a few of these key points. Colin.
Yeah, man. Thanks, Doug. Thanks, Lisa. So I've got two yarns for you, like Blackfellow storytelling, and I suppose it's the presentation platforms that they exist on. Yeah. I'd like to, two examples. One part was it involved my contribution and input as a storyteller myself in the form of performance and as an actor, and what in my years as an actor has revealed to me that performance actors and actors are profoundly and undeniably storytellers, and they're in the search of truth. These two examples extended the strength of storytelling, a representation for me as a Gamilaroi man, and then, as a First Nation and the First Nation communities that I'm a part of. So that first example was a theatre production that was at the start of the year through this New South Wales only First Nation theatre company, and it was called, the play was called The Visitors, and it had its world premiere earlier this year, as I was saying, in January as part of Sydney Festival 2020. The cultural storytelling elements as theatre, as all you would hope and imagine, are high, and if not the highest priority in that sort of situation. The theatre organisation I mentioned honours and advocates for a delivery of strong, new and important First Nation storytelling voices through the medium of theatre and its, its associated procedures of script development and playwriting development and, all those things associated with that. The theatre production team consisted of a First Nation playwright, First Nation director, First Nation actors, and a First Nation producer, which is the company itself, yeah? From pre-production to the season to post-production, the engagement journey weaved a strong cultural bind that provided safe cultural sound environment that allowed all the participants to experience respect, self-worth, and valued each person's involvement and opinion in honouring the storytelling which is you as an actor, as an actor, you're honoring the storytelling of the playwright. So that was really profound for me. And within that, as a performer and as an actor, you're not wasting time sort of, the nuances of like trying to, if there's the other working with you, you're not wasting time going in and sort of extending yourself about what it's like to be a blackfellow, or, you're just getting on to the most important part, which is being creative and engaging and honoring the storytelling. So that was inclusive. That example for me was an exclusive opportunity and experience of being respected right through that whole experience. Now, something that happened about the other example, the other example about 2 months ago, 8 weeks ago, I did a skit, a comedy skit for the national broadcaster. That was in a comedy show called Home Together Alone, and it was co-written by Gamilla Roy Mann. I was contacted and asked directly by the producers if I wanted to be in that skit. I got sent this skit, get the script, and I really liked it, and I really liked what the storyteller was saying, i.e. the script writer. And I understood what it was to be, which was very sort of a good piece of satire, what comedy, we all need comedy, right, in our lives. The day of the filming happened. It was interesting. It's where I felt culturally unsafe. I turned up. I had to introduce myself. No one was there to sort of gauge and do that business, that cultural business of not welcoming, but like making sure that you as a participant, part of a group, felt safe. And there are the others. Most of them were white on that set. And so we did it, we filmed it, and then I suppose, I kind of got out of there really quick because there was no sort of cultural safety. We all have been in experiences like that where we don't feel safe, whether we feel welcomed or whether our opinion and our contribution isn't valued. One example of highlighting being in an experience in a cultural safe environment where they're culturally aware with an organization, and then the other side is you didn't feel safe because there wasn't mechanisms put in place. I'll just finish off by stating this, or questioning to you all. Is it better for a bigger and wider exposure that sees your work, as a storyteller or as a script writer or a content creator, and then have your story modified in many processes, and that has a really wide spectrum of engagement and being, you've got a great audience? Or would you prefer something that values your storytelling abilities, your cultural background, and maybe not as big an exposure? I don't know what, but I think I know what I would prefer. And maybe that's something to think about as well, yeah? In this fight of trying to get the right, in the age of storytelling and the age of truth-telling, whose side you're on, I suppose. So thanks for allowing me to share those two examples. I'd like to pass now on to Rafi. Are you there, my brother?
Yes. Thank you, Colin, for sharing that.
Thanks, brother. Thank you.
No worries. Like Lisa and Doug and Colin, one of the main issues I faced as a storyteller was, as I said in the introduction, was that obligation or that pressure to share a story, and that kind of sense that you owe that story to others. And you know, the obligation or the gratitude that you should feel for being asked and that you should accept immediately, particularly if that organization has supported you in the past. So I have a little story to share that can demonstrate this in practice, how that could happen. One of the organizations that supported me in the past used to ask me every now and then to share my story, usually through asking a couple of questions around why I left Syria, the risks that are facing people like me, and how they supported me and how I was doing now. Now, that was fine, and I used to participate in these, answer these questions, until in 2018, I was under a lot of pressure in my studies, and I thought I should maybe avoid being distracted, as I was receiving a lot of invitations at that point. So I declined that organization's invitation, and I explained why. Immediately after that, one of their senior staff responded to me by saying that he was very disappointed that I couldn't save a few minutes of my time to share my story, given what they've done for me. He then told me that they needed these stories for outreach work to get funding and to continue the work they're doing. Now, for me, that story illustrates that the focus is no longer on the story itself or its power, or even on the person sharing that story. The focus is on the organization that is seeking donations and further support for their work. So in this instance, storytelling or stories have become commercialized to seek funding or to shed tears and to, you know, to kind of convey a certain emotion and invoke certain emotions in others. Now, the other risk for me personally that stories can have is if they essentialize identities. And that can be very tricky because that can happen in a lot of cases unintentionally, really. Like it's usually done by well-meaning people, including people from refugee or other backgrounds. So as you know, some people from refugee backgrounds may not like to be labeled as refugees, mainly because of the stigma associated with that label. And maybe they just don't want to have to explain all that baggage that comes with the term, or maybe answer questions that always come after you tell someone you're from an X place. I usually, for instance, when I tell people I'm from Syria, they would be like, it's one of two. The response I get is normally one of two. So it's either say, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, are you okay? So like overly sympathetic and kind of as if like, kind of, they look at you as if you're some kind of traumatized victim, and they just assume that you're just like troubled soul. Or the other response I get normally is that sometimes people are like, oh, so what do you think of ISIS? Do you support Al-Qaeda? Do you think of, what are you? So it's really tricky. So a lot of the times I find myself really not maybe sharing that particular part, unless it's in an environment that I think it can contribute to the discussion, such as in this environment. So that's why I think it's always best to ask people from refugee backgrounds or other backgrounds to ask them about their identities, how they like to be addressed, how they like to be kind of referred to, rather than assume that identity for them. And I'll give you a short anecdote that could illustrate this. A few months ago, I was invited to become a mentor for people from refugee backgrounds. Now, I accepted to join. This is something I'm very passionate about, mentoring. I was a mentor in the past. I'm participating in several mentoring or coordinating several mentoring programs at university. So I immediately joined. A few days later, the organizer sent me the material that she used for the training for all the participants. Now I went through the material and I noticed that all the other mentors, so they have like a page for all the available mentors in this program, and all the other mentors were described as lawyers, doctors, businessmen, businesswomen, journalists. And then when it was my turn, next to it was refugee, as if that was all I would ever be. So for me, that was just like felt very restricting, like they boxing me in that category. And what was interesting is that that organizer was from a refugee background herself. And she thought that labeling me as a refugee is meant to encourage others to join. And, you know, but obviously the issue here is that she did not check. She just assumed. And she didn't even explain why other mentors were not described as refugees, although some of them were from a refugee background. So again, it's all about that assumption, and it's all about kind of checking with others. So basically, as you would do with any other person from any other profession, you would ask them how they'd like to be addressed or labeled, rather than assuming. Now in the workshop, I'm going to share some excellent examples that have excellent practices by people that I've worked with that really made me realize these kind of issues. So a lot of these issues that I started realizing, I did not realize them sometimes at the time, but later through a lot of positive interactions. And that's what I'll be delving on during the workshop. But for now, I'm going to hand it back to Doug, who's going to conclude the session before moving to Q&A. Thank you.
All right. So as you can see, all these stories that Rifai, Lisa, and Colin have shared, really asking those questions about, you know, their position there, where they're being asked to share a story in not safe spaces, and many of these other issues. So what we want to talk about as well as part of this, to try and understand it better, is to ask the right questions. So when we first look at it, we need to first acknowledge that we need to look at our own practices. And these questions can actually support us in working out if we're using the best practice or not. So asking that question, what is the purpose of the story? Do we need to use a story or not for this circumstance? Who is being asked to share the story and why? So when we think about who is the person, and Lisa talked about the burden placed on particular people sharing their stories. Who is asking for the story and why? Very important one, because when we think about who might be asking for that story, maybe we need to question the purpose of that story again. Who has designed the space for the delivery of the story? Again, that idea of safe space. And that safe space is from the very beginning to the end. What conditions are placed on the story? Are the conditions just going one way? Are the conditions so strong that the story just becomes curated and is actually not the story of the storyteller or the communities that are meant to be represented in it? What time is the story being shared? Is it tokenistic? Is it just a performative action? Or is it there as a greater benefit for the organization who are trying to move towards anti-racism? And what importance is placed on the curation direction of the story? So we need to think not just about what looks like in front of the camera, but what's happening behind the camera. And this is from the very first step. And this goes to the first question that I always ask now: who benefits from the story? Because when we ask that, who benefits from the story, we can also ask the question of who is impacted by the story. And this has sort of led us, and this theory that was starting to develop and trying to put into practice, is what I call these storytelling pyramids of power, where what we see is the institution is at the top, setting the conditions of the story, which then goes through to the audience, which is generally the organization staff and clients. And what I described earlier, I was part of an institution where we were so focused on the audience. Then we have media comms, marketing teams who start working on what does that story look like? How do we make sure it's quick, snappy, and reaches the needs of what the institution is after? Then we have the storytelling providers, which a lot of people here probably are from, where it's the organizations and individuals who are high in social trust and therefore we believe have a duty of care. So these are like the organizations where they reach out to the storytellers to ask them to share their story in particular events. How can we make sure that we are taking more care in the way that we ask storytellers? Because I know if I ask someone to share their story that I've already got that high social trust, they're not going to ask why. So we have a responsibility. And so in the end, by the story and the conditions being set, the storytellers and communities have the least power of the construction and the direction of that story, and also that ownership. So what we work towards is this idea of how do we flip this power of storytelling? And so this idea is, it's idealistic. We want to reach this point and we understand it's about shifting it. This is sort of the end goal, like anti-racism is the end goal. but anti-racism is a journey. And so for us, it's where the storytellers and communities move to the top. So we're centering it around the storytellers and communities, not following a formula of storytelling. We're actually challenging that Western formula of storytelling to look at it in a different way. How do the storytellers and the communities become the owners of their story and understand that they can set the conditions as well? And this is a key piece of work that we're working on at the moment, is we're trying to work out, especially working with media organizations and other corporates, is what rights does a storyteller have in the ownership of the story, intellectual property, and these sort of issues that come up quite a lot around sort of the storytelling process. And so this then places the storyteller providers as a very important conduit to still that social trust and duty of care, but asking more questions of the institution, working closer with the media team to make sure, first and foremost, the story is about the storytellers and the communities. We can still reach audiences. We can still have those broader audiences. But as Colin said before, what's more important? Is it the reach, or is it the genuinity of that story and making sure that story is owned by the people who should be owning that story? And that's what we're sort of working towards. So it's not an easy task, and we see that it will take time to get there. But if we go on this journey together and start thinking about how can we engage with storytellers in a better way, including them from the beginning of the process, makes a big difference. Understanding the different legal implications and the power that sits within organizations compared to individuals and communities. So for us, this whole idea of flipping the story, how do we get there? And this is about what we're looking at and building is this framework, which is an adaptable framework with key principles. These are just some of the key principles that we're looking at. And I'm going to ask you now, if you'd like to share any ask any questions, you can start putting them in the chat box. We'll start getting to them in the next 2 minutes. So for us, applying this framework there's a lot of parts that we need to look at. So we need to also look at what is the starting point of the organizations or communities we're part of? What enablers do we have? And what are some of the barriers and how can we overcome those? So these key points that we've put here, and we'll go into a lot more detail in the workshop, is this idea of genuine engagement and inclusion from the beginning to the end. Providing the opportunity, not the obligation to share a story, ensuring you create a safe space. And that will come into as a priority if we're engaging from the beginning with the right people. Briefing storytellers, not just before, but also after, and also being there, maybe period of time after that, because we don't know what impact that story could have. Then encouraging the storyteller to use their creative control, not to fit into the formulas that often we set. We need to properly value our storytellers. This means about payment. Too often we see everybody else being paid, but the person who's the storyteller themselves is not. And it's not just payment. There are other ways we can acknowledge our storytellers. Not only, also that idea of them not just being storytellers, but actually having other roles as well. Knowing who's involved in the storytelling process. The more questions we ask of organizations that we are collaborating with, the more we understand what are the purpose of that storytelling. Then we'll be able to answer these questions of who's benefiting from that story and how, which in turn will allow us to see what are some of the potential impacts of that story. And then finally, evaluation. If we can evaluate it, we can start capturing an evidence base to see if these processes work and continually building on this. We can't just sit there thinking that this is the way and just go with it. We need to keep on adapting it. So with that, I'm going to leave it over for questions, but I would like to just say, we hope that this has raised some ideas for you, whether it be a new approach, confirmed an approach, made you think things a bit differently. But hopefully in the end, what we can do is with our storytelling practices, we can start moving towards an anti-racism practices, methodologies and practices. And we can start calling out racist practices and calling in anti-racist ones. First question is about the burden. Well, I can see it's one of the later ones. How is burden defined? Hey, Lisa, do you want to talk about burden from your perspective?
Yeah, yes, perfect. Burden, I think, comes into play when you look at the singularity of a request or the singularity of an action, right? And especially in my particular circumstance, it was as the only person of color who had a story to share, my being asked to share my story, but that would be the only thing that they would do to address the problem. So burden is the organization itself taking on any responsibility for addressing the problem? It has to, when you ask that question, it's through the lens of self-reflection. What else are we doing? How are we walking alongside the person or the persons with whom we are making this request to? It has to be a collaborative process. And I think as custodians of the story, of the stories, you need to come to that answer through asking yourself the question: are we putting the burden on this person? It's not so much about the length of the request, or I think it's not so much about the length of the request, it's the singularity of that request being in a vacuum. Is it a part of something greater? And is it a part of something that we as an organization are taking on responsibility for holistically?
Yeah, it's a burdensome manifestation, isn't it? And I reckon when organizations aren't aware of constructing something like that, or, you know, haven't investigated to see if it's going to be a burden on the people that, well, you know, the artists or the content creators or the storytellers, and how and what it means for them. They can't measure the ask, you know, because they've existed in ways of just, you know, taking the story from us and then manipulating it.
A lot of questions here, but what we'll do, we won't get to all of them today, but we will get to them in the workshop. So with the workshop, what we really want to do is unpack this further. There were a few questions in there about, you know, how do we unpack this further? And so some of them are people who are storytellers themselves. And one of the big parts for us is how can we develop supporting mechanisms to help the storytellers and also those working with storytellers, because under the current working with media, you have a consent form and the person signs it, but that's all we know that happens. What actually happens in the process? So the conditions are pretty much sent just from the media organization to that person or the community organization. We're trying to develop something with a legal firm at the moment where the conditions go back the other way. So it's almost a contract for the storyteller to send to the organization that asks them for the story. So that will fit into that framework. And we're going to be open. We're going to be sharing this with people. We're going to, as a public resource, because we really want to try and shift how storytelling is being shared. Okay. I'm going to leave with each of my co-facilitators to give maybe a last comment question before we let everybody go. Lisa, you're on my screen, so I'll go to you first.
Yes, I would like to talk about safe space, and I think you start creating that by acknowledging that by setting the intention that it be a collaborative process. That the power dynamic is not I'm here and I'm asking someone below me to share a story. I'm not that it's not an exchange of using someone for your benefits. You know, I think if you're conscious of your intention and if you consciously create a process of collaboration and a balanced power dynamic, that will shift how you engage a person. It will shift what questions you ask you, and it will shift how you manage the process and the product that comes out at the end. So it starts from here. It starts from the questions that you ask yourself. And this work really is about, it's almost a personal growth process, because it involves working on yourself, looking at yourself, questioning your own motives, and taking that self-reflection back into the process and being very open and conversational and curious, and inviting and sharing the space with the person with the storyteller that you're engaging with.
Thank you, Lisa. I think I might just add to that, following up on that is the importance of humility and openness and reflection whenever we're engaging in storytelling, whether we storytellers or facilitators or people who are empowering or working with them. I think this is an endless journey, and every time I attend a workshop or an event like this, or I share a story, there's something new I learn. During the last workshop I participated in, there were a lot of, we had a scenario where we asked participants to think through some of the things that storytellers should think of before they accept an invitation. And a lot of participants gave me so many ideas. It was really inspiring, and it just shows that, as long as we just open to learning new perspective, I think that's our best hope. Thank you all for joining today. I'll pass it on to Colin, who might have final words.
Thank you, brother. It's inspiring, It's inspiring to see who turned up today. It's inspiring to see who thinks about what storytelling is and seeing how we can change that and redress what exists now. And then, because we know that there's something almost criminally wrong with how stories are used and how we're part of stories. All of us are part of stories. All of us are part of, and are responsible for sharing stories. And I hope that you'll join us next week, because you're inspiring, because all of you have stories and all of you are advocating for storytellers, and I believe in this way, that chart that Doug was showing with us, briefly, and that will be talked about in, drilled down a lot more in the workshop next time, So it's inspiring to see you all turn up, and I thank you for that, and we all thank you for that. It's about challenging the model that we have and the organizations that we work for, or that we're in, or the institutions that we're part of or know of, or have previous or possibly future dealings with. Yeah, let's change it. Can everyone say Maraba Ginda?
Maraba Ginda.
Put it. Everyone. Thank you. That's thank you in my language. And thank you. You just said thank you to us. So thank you all. And we hope to see you next week in our workshop for Transformational. I always get trip up on that word. Transformational, ethical storytelling. Thank you, guys.